So I'm calling the presentation In Praise of Shadows, and I'll explain that in a little bit later. But basically, the point of the presentation is that shadows can be used to create more impactful photographs. You hear the phrase, it's all about the light. And we know that you got to have light in order to do photography. Light's key to photography. But frankly, if you don't include shadows in your photographs, a lot of times they come out rather middling in their quality. Goethe made a statement that where there is the most light, the shadows are the heaviest. And shadows depend on the light. Shadows are important to good photographs. They're more than just the places where the light doesn't happen to fall. They actually play positive roles in creative photography. They define the light. You know where the light's coming from by where the shadows fall. And frankly, a lot of times photographs that only have light and are without very many shadows can tend to be boring. I have made this presentation based on Michael Freeman's recent book, Light and Shadow. And he argues that shadows are as important as light. For example, if this image of the prairie dog didn't have shadows, it would be flat and much less interesting than it is. Shadows are important to photos in a number of different ways. When they make up compositional elements like geometrical forms, they become a part of the composition of the photograph. They provide counterpoints to lighter areas within the frame. In some cases, shadows constitute negative space. They can often add mystery, ambiguity, and depth to photographs. They define the shape, the location, and the source from which the light is coming. They can be a source of texture within the photograph. And as I'm going to explain more, they come in a wide range of tones. The title of the presentation came from a book by Junichiro Tanizaki called In Praise of Shadows. He was a Japanese writer in the early part of the 20th century who talked about the importance of shadows within Japanese culture. He argues that shadows are much more highly valued in Asian culture than they are in Western culture. And he argued that they add what he called a moment of trance to situations, not just photographs, but to all of life. Shadows have a wide tonal range. If you think about the 11-point zone system, 5 of those zones are shadows. That's almost half of the tonal range of the zone system. Highlights only make up about 2 zones, and anything that's left over is the midtones. So shadows at the lightest are open shadows, and I'll show some examples of that later. They fall into zone 4. Shadows that fall into zone 3 may be textured. The texture shows up in the photographs. When you get to deep shadows in zones 1 and 2, there's almost no texture. You're looking at things that are extremely dark, but not totally black. And then there are situations in which there are portions of the photograph that are
That's
totally
fine.
black,
That's much as
and
I
that
can get right now.
falls into the zero zone. So here's an example of a totally black shadow. I mean, the background basically is absolutely black. And I'm going to show some types of shadows later. This happens to be an example of what was called the background style shadow. Shadows also can have texture. And here's an example where the columns, the walls, and the ground all show some texture. Now, this is sort of minimal texture, but texture nonetheless. And this photograph actually is an example of several types of shadows that we're going to talk about later. The man taking the photograph is in silhouette. The columns and the sort of window-like areas on the right-hand side of the photograph exhibit repetition, and you get cast shadows from the columns reaching out onto the ground floor there. And cast shadows are one of the styles that I'll be talking about later. Open shadows are situations in which a subject is gently shadowed. In this case, her face is side lit, and that's pretty typical of this kind of situation in which light may be falling partially on the subject. The shadowed area is very mild because there's reflected fill light coming into it. Fill light may come from a wall or something that's reflecting light back onto the subject, or in a setup scene, you can actually use a reflector to minimize the depth of the shadow. One of the major points that I want to make is that shadows have much greater tonal range than highlights do. And if you look at this photograph, you see, modest shadows cast onto the floor, but then a range of different shadows throughout the image, on the columns, on the roof, above the archway in the distance, different levels of darkness and depth throughout the image. So now what I want to do is show some examples of types of shadows or different styles. These are all drawn from Michael Freeman's book, Light and Shadow. He identified 10 different shadow types. I'm not going to show 10, but I'll show most of the ones that he has. The basic kind of shadow he calls basic rich. And this is a situation in which there are deep shadows that provides good contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. And he regards this as a default kind of shadow that doesn't fit into any of the other types of shadows that are more specific. Here's another example of what he calls basic rich. The background in the distance is black or very close to black. There's a little bit of definition in it. A deep shadow on the subject, and the lighting is cross lighting. The second type of shadow is called a backdrop shadow, in which the background is basically totally black. The subject stands out sharply from the background, and the black background frames the subject. Here's another example. This is an American crocodile, one of about 50 in existence in the Everglades. And in this case, the black shadow above the crocodile's head sets it off, so that the highlights make the subject stand out boldly. A special kind of backdrop is where the backdrop forms a frame around some other kind of object. Typically, arches and tunnels are used for this kind of purpose, where the backdrop frames the subject. Here's another example of backdrop as a frame. This is a tunnel in the Cornish fort at Tintagel. It dates from King Arthur's time, and mythologically said to have been King Arthur's seat. But in this case, also the arch roof of the tunnel forms a shape that highlights the opening in the distance. This is also an example of a type called receding shadow, in which the foreground is very dark and it gets progressively lighter as it moves toward the opening. I'll show some more examples of that later. Deep shadow is another type. In this case, the shadows are dark, but they're not totally black. You do see some texture in the shadows. Here's another example of deep shadow, again, where the texture in the background is dim but evident, but it allows the subject to stand out boldly. Receding shadows, I showed you one example of that earlier. Here's another one, an English cathedral, where basically the light falls off from the camera's position into the distance. It's dark. The aisle is dark near the camera's position, and it gets progressively lighter as it leads toward the window in the distance. It is possible to have receding shadows reversed, in which the dark is in the distance and the light gets progressively lighter toward the camera's position. I don't have any examples of that, though. Here's another example of receding shadows. This is one of the hallways in the Library of Congress. And again, the eye is led toward the light in the distance by sort of the framing that the darkness provides to the pathway of light. Another type is called volumetric shadow. And in this case, what it is side lighting that leaves you with a graded shadow. It moves from the dark on the right-hand side of the dome to a lighter area on the left-hand side. I mean, the light is obviously coming from the left, but the value of this is that because the lighting is side lighting, you can see that this is a rounded dome. If the light had been hitting it straight on, it might look flat. You lose the volume aspect of it. This happens to be the Pima County Courthouse in Phoenix. Here's another example of volumetric shadow. This is in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, and again, the light coming from the left makes the curvature of this coffee pot building apparent. If it didn't have the shadow, it would end up looking flat within the image. This is a very special type of shadow that Freeman calls the reflective shadow, where the glow from a light source, a dim light source, reflects back onto the subject and creates unusual kinds of shadowing. Sometimes this happens when the light source is not visible. In this case, you can see the light source of the glass blower, but it can be off camera as well. Open shadows are gently cast shadows. Usually there's some kind of fill light or fill surface where light is reflected off of another surface into the shadowed area so that they're rendered softly. This is Mesa Verde in Colorado. Here's another case, open shadow. Actually, that's my wife and my granddaughter. They're in both cases, the shadows on their faces are gentle because there's reflected light that's cast into their faces. Another style of shadow is called graded shadow, where the shadows are gently graded from dark to light. This works best when there's a smooth surface. I don't have a photograph that has a smooth surface. This is sort of patterned on the bottom of a staircase, actually, in Greenwich, England. This kind of shadow is mostly found in architecture and in studio setups. It's very rare to find this kind of thing in nature. Another type of shadow is chiaroscuro, and there are several different types of that kind of lighting. In this case, light is being filtered through a screen of branches onto the baby elephant that creates a modeled pattern. This kind of lighting can be quite dramatic, where the patterns that are cast onto the subject become interesting in their own right. A second type of chiaroscuro is where light from a fairly small light source is cast down onto, usually from up above, onto a subject, forming a rather dramatic kind of lighting. It's highly selective lighting. It has the advantage of hiding a lot of details, but it also provides a certain amount of drama. And another form of chiaroscuro is where a light source, a very small light source, casts geometric patterns. The light has to be a hard directional source. The subject has to be something that can cast sharp shadows. This happens to be a cheese grater that was lit with a little lume cube off to one side. Another type of shadow is called cast shape. And this is a situation in which a recognizable subject is seen in shadow onto something flat like a wall. In this case, it's obviously a steam locomotive. And you can see in pretty clear terms the outline of that engine. This kind of shadow needs to be sharp in order to be effective. If it were if it were fuzzy, it would diminish the impact. Sometimes this kind of shadow can show the subject as well as the shadow. And here's an example of that. This is a wildebeest whose shadow is cast onto the ground, but you're seeing both the wildebeest and the shadow. Here's another example of cast shape. In this case, in Yellowstone National Park, you see the photographer, and in the lower right-hand side, the photographer's friend, both of whom are on this program tonight. I mean, that's me and Jeff, I think. Another kind of shadow is silhouette. And silhouettes are made by dark subjects standing out against a light background. In this case, the subjects are not totally black, but I still think it's a pretty good photograph. And it does illustrate the concept of silhouettes. But the most effective ones are when the subject is totally black. Here's an example of that, a cannon on the Manassas Battlefield Park. Freeman argues that the smaller the subject is within the frame, the more important it is that it be totally black. And here's another example of silhouette, in which the nice clear background allows the Kokopellis to stand out very clearly. Another kind of shadow, another kind of silhouette is the multiple receding silhouette, in which if you get a situation, usually it's involving mountains or hills, and if there's atmospheric haze or smoke, they can appear to be layered as they recede into the distance. And you frequently see this kind of photograph, but it is a type of shadow that, when you're able to find it, can be quite effective. So those are the types or styles of shadows. Shadows require special care when it comes to exposure and post-processing. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about that. The cameras and software are basically set to do a good job with midtones, as in this photograph, which is pretty much midtones and not very much in terms of shadows. Cameras handle midtones very well, and processing software is geared toward midtones rather than toward shadows. So in order to get shadows, you first have to have good exposure. Midtones are what our eyes are used to seeing, though. Our eyes are capable of taking in an extremely wide range of tones and basically adjusting them all so that they look like midtones to us. We come to expect midtones in what we see. And when we see things that aren't midtones, we react to them. The point that I would make, and that Freeman makes, is that if you're wanting your photographs to look like midtones, you don't really need to make very many adjustments. You can kind of set your camera on automatic and it will do the job. And modern cameras do a really good job of handling midtones. But the most interesting photographs are the ones where there are tonal extremes. There's a lot less excitement in midtones, but when you have extreme light and shadow, you get a special character of what's going on. your eyes are naturally drawn to the highlights, but the shadows set up the highlights. And without the shadows, the highlights will look like midtones. There's a lot more differentiation in the shadowed areas, however, than there is in the highlights. And in order to get good shadows, you need to take care in both exposure and processing. Now, I know you all know this already, but basically, the dominant tones in an image can fool your camera meter. The camera meter is intended, it's set to capture midtones and do a good job of them. But in a scene like this snowy scene, if you allow the meter to take over, it'll come out looking gray. You really have to change your metering. You have to override the meter in order to get the kind of image that you want to get, both for bright highlights or for deep shadows, both of which will fool your meter. It's important when you're photographing and you want to make use of both highlights and shadows that you pay attention to the histogram. For shadows, usually the advice is exposed to the right, ETTR, so that you push the histogram not so that it's blocked up on the right, but so that it's close to the right. But for shadows, you may want to do the opposite. In order to get blackness within your image, you may need to push the histogram to the left. Freeman makes the point, and I think he's right about this, that if you're wanting shadows, use HDR cautiously or not at all. And the reason is HDR is basically taking the extremes of highlights and shadows and compressing them into midtones. If what you want is midtones in a very contrasty scene, HDR is good. But if you want to use the contrast to emphasize the both the shadows and the highlights in a case like this photograph, then HDR is probably not your friend. So post-processing is also a critical part of handling shadows. Both capturing your photographs and processing are linked. Especially that's true in digital photography. Freeman points out that if you decide not to post-process, you're going to get some post-processing anyway, because the camera will do that automatically. It's just that you may not get what you want if you do not control the situation yourself. He points out that there are a couple of failings that you may get. One is if you don't use the tools, your images may come out flat. Or if you overuse the tools, you may exaggerate effects and come up with results that are not realistic. So basically, you need to be careful about how you handle your post-processing. So what should an image look like? What should a photo look like? Back in film days, the look of a photograph was sort of baked into the film. You shot and that's what you got. You didn't have much alternative in terms of how things were handled. With digital photography, however, things are very different. You can widely vary the effects that you achieve. Freeman considers that traditional looks include having smooth tonal gradations, a full range from black to white, and sharpness that is at the edges of subjects and not necessarily all over the whole image. Now, one of the questions is, what should a photograph look like? The fact is, photographs, as you edit them, are open to multiple interpretations. Here are two photographs or two versions of the same photograph from Bryce Canyon. So the question is, which of these is better? I think, they're probably both acceptable, but you may react to one of them as being better than the other. And the fact of the matter is, it's a question of personal choice, how you make the photograph look. How you edit your photographs, how you handle your shadows is a chance that you have to express your own style as you handle your photographs. Here's another example of a pretty worn set of stairs in some English cathedral. I don't recall which one at this point. And either of those is an acceptable representation of those steps, but you may react more strongly to one of them than the other. And that's because we each have different ideas of style and how we think things ought to look. And that's okay. What it basically says is that you have some choices to make when you get into editing your shadows. So when you're processing and you want to use shadows, you need to process to emphasize the shadows. Shadows are not averages, they're tonal extremes. They exist at the lower end of the zone system. And if you want to use them, you need to make sure that's how they show up in your image. If you allow them to slip into midtones, you get a very different kind of result, and you may be less satisfied with it. The fact is that deep shadows are more dramatic than subtle shadows are. And I think your goal needs to be to have a wide range of tones within your image. However, you want to avoid overlightening your image, and you do want to allow your shadows to go black. When you're editing, you have the options of default processing will handle the midtones just fine. When you're processing, you can make global adjustments to the things that you're going to change, but you also need to use local adjustments to enhance certain areas of the image that can benefit from that kind of treatment. Adjusting the brightness range within the image is important to how the shadows and the lights are represented. The risk, of course, is overdoing it and creating a result that's unbelievable. You want your results to look believable, even if you are emphasizing the drama within the image. This photograph is also from Manassas Battlefield Park. So you want to you want to make your image fit your vision. This is really about visualization. You want to mask your selected subjects and edit locally to allow your subject to stand out from the background or from the highlights. When you're editing, focus on the exposure slider, the contrast slider, and the black and white points. Freeman argues that editing using the highlights slider, the shadow slider, clarity, and dehaze, they all emphasize midtones. And his inclination is to avoid using them much of the time. So he focuses on contrast, exposure, and black and white points for establishing the depth of shadows within his images. Here's something that seems controversial. It's okay to push the black point far to the left when you're editing, even to the point of blocking up the blacks. When you do that, it basically just means you're going to get some areas that are totally black within your image. And if that's the objective of your image, if that's what your visualization calls for, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Blocking up highlights is a problem. Blocking up shadows is not necessarily a problem unless you want to show some texture within the shadowed area. So to conclude, shadows can be important to making really interesting photographs, and you should make use of them whenever you have the opportunity to do so.